So some of the lessons we're thinking about this week, they are all more or less derived from space. So the kids went downstairs, they're going to learn about the story of creation, thinking about that idea of let there be light. But as I was thinking about prepping for the adult class this week, I thought, well, those are good lessons, those are good things to study about, but I want to make this a little bit more practical for us. So the downstairs class is tonight using Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, and God said, let there be light. It's kind of their main verse. But tonight I want to take that a slightly different direction. Open your Bibles, if you would, to 1 John chapter 1, beginning in verse number 5. 1 John chapter 1, beginning in verse number 5. This idea of walking in the light is kind of the theme of 1 John. The Apostle John wrote these three epistles as well as the Gospel of John that we'll spend some time in here in just a little while. But the idea of light in general. We've got several farmers in here. Light is kind of important. You need the daylight to get the work done. You need the daylight to make things grow. But I do want to back up just a little bit and preface this by saying I'm in the middle of college right now, and it drives me nuts when I just have to sit in a 50-minute lecture and just listen. So if at any time you have thoughts, comments, questions, I have some discussion comments and things like that in my notes that we'll spend some time thinking about. But this is a class for us to be able to learn from. I'm by far not the wisest person in this room. I guarantee there are people in here that know a whole lot more than I do. So feel free to share that knowledge that you have. Let's have a good conversation. I know we joke about sending the kids to Vacation Bible School, but it's kind of my hope tonight and throughout the rest of the week that we're all able to take a little bit from Vacation Bible School. So back to this idea of light, though. I want to stop just for a minute and let you think about this. Where would mankind be without light? Where would mankind be without light?
In the dark.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, exactly. Thomas went and turned off the lights back here. I thought about having him do this with the kids, but then probably decided against it. If turn off the lights, there's no way to see. There's no way to really be productive. We rely on light for growth. We rely on light for warmth. We rely on light for all sorts of different things. So, this idea coming back to 1 John chapter 1, beginning in verse number 5. The New King James Version, it says, "This is the message which we have heard from him and declare to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness." The first thought about this idea of light is this is a demonstration of God's power. Let there be light, he says in Genesis 1 verse 3. It's a reflection of God's nature. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say that we have fellowship and walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. So this idea of light, first and foremost, it demonstrates God's power over quite literally anything. I can say, let there be light, and go flip a switch, and probably impress the cradle roll class up here. But I don't have the ability to say, let there be light, and there just be light. That's something that God alone can do. Just that infinite amount of power that's almost hard for us to grasp at times. But it reflects his nature, which is something that I find quite interesting. John doesn't say God is like light or God is compared to light. He says God is light. All those ideas that we have about light, for that warmth, for that growth, for that beauty, things of that nature, those are all attributes of God. John then flips that on his head. Verse 6 here, it says, if we walk in the darkness, if we are basically the antithesis of everything that God is, there's no reconciliation between the two. I can't walk in darkness. I can't walk in sin. I can't walk in things like that, and yet claim to be a part of the light. They're diametrically opposed. There is no reconciling those two things. But then turn over now, if you would, to John chapter 1, verse number 9. John chapter 1, verse number 9. I do kind of like to bounce around a little bit. We'll spend quite a bit of time finding several different passages and things like that. But just so we can all kind of get a picture of what we're thinking about here. John chapter 1, beginning in verse number 6. Now we all know the Gospel of John begins a little bit differently than the rest of the Gospels, but this really captures the point that we're thinking about tonight. John chapter 1, beginning in verse number 6. It says, "There was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world. Now, kind of this whole idea, I know I've got the New King James. I'm not sure if the King James has it or not. But in this passage, that word light, the L is capitalized, referring to something. You go back to John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That W there in the word Word is capitalized, referring to Christ. Much the same way, that light is referring to Christ. Not only is light a demonstration of God's power when he said, "Let there be light," not only is it a reflection of God's nature when John says God is light, it's proof of God's plan, that true light which gives light to the world. And we think about, we have the ability to look back on the Bible and look back on history and all of those things and see the Old Testament prophecies. Go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12 to see those things fulfilled. There's a blessing coming. There's something great coming to Abraham, to his descendants, all of that. That blessing was this light in John chapter 1, verse number 9. It's proof of God's plan. It shows that from the beginning, God already had that in mind. He knew the world was going to dissolve essentially into darkness, into sin. They were going to go away from exactly what God had in mind. But this is the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world. I like how it makes that singular there. It says John was not the true light. He was the one just kind of sent to show the way and things like that. Now, I'm sure we could turn on to, you find the right channel, you can find someone that claims to be from God or sent from God or something along those lines. They're really not. I've had a vision from God, or I'm speaking this truth from God, or all of these different things. That's not the true light. We already have the true light. Everything else is, for lack of a better term, it's a cheap knockoff. It's those cheap little flashlights. Now, you could buy the really nice, expensive police-grade flashlights or heavy-duty flashlights, or you can go to Walmart and buy a flashlight too, right? There's a big difference in the quality. There's one true light, John 1, verse 9, but there's a whole lot of other people claiming to be otherwise. But with that idea, we thought about it a little bit already. With that idea of light, there's got to be a contrast, right? That idea of light versus dark. Think about, and here's another question for us to think about. We watch movies, we hear all these different things. That old cliche, the light versus the dark, the light always wins. You've got Star Wars back in 1977, I think. Really, the good versus the evil, and the light and dark, all of that. That contrast that we have isn't something new. That goes all the way back to the very beginning. God spoke into the darkness and said, "Let there be light," and there was light. I'm curious, what other kind of real-life examples do you have of that light versus the dark? And we always think, well, the light's always going to come out on top, and that's not always the case. I think one good example of that is the church today. Think about some other examples, though. What are some good examples of the light versus the dark that really help us grasp the picture of this contrast here?
Well, I think in some ways, these examples aren't as meaningful to us in some ways, because in our society, we run factories 24/7. We can farm at night, everything. We have so many man-made lights. But if you think back to before electricity, and like if any of y'all ever been on the Cumberland Caverns tour, right?
Mm-hmm.
Been on here?
Yeah.
At one point, at least back when I went, they actually turn off the lights, and it is, you hold your hand up and cannot see. And I think that because so many people have security lights and street lights that, until you go to some place like Cumberland Caverns or someplace and really see that contrast, how sharp that contrast is between light and dark. And I think that's what Jesus is talking about. Sometimes some things are lost in us a little bit because we don't, we have things they didn't have.
Exactly, and that's a really good illustration, one I didn't think of. If you take the Cumberland Caverns tour, we've worked a big youth rally there for several years. You can go in there and literally cannot see anything because of the darkness. But you even think about that on a broader scale. I've been to New York City a few times. Absolutely love New York City. The city that there's always lights on. It's never really all that dark. We've stood in Times Square at 2 a.m. and it's really not that much different than standing there at 2 in the afternoon because there's so much light. But you stop and think about that, we're a whole lot more comfortable in the light, right? It's a whole lot easier to drive. It's a whole lot easier to see. It's a whole lot easier to be more comfortable. Think about, I was going to ask Jason, but Jason's not here tonight. Probably a whole lot more crimes. He works for the sheriff's department. A whole lot more crimes happen at night than they do in the day.
I was thinking about too, that thought. I don't know if they do it anymore, but they used to lock prisoners in solitary confinement inside a dark cell. So that would be bad enough punishment as it was.
Yeah. Just that idea of not having access to any kind of light whatsoever. I mean, what are you going to do in the dark? You really can't accomplish a whole lot. You can't read, you can't see, you literally can't do anything in that darkness. And really that kind of paints us a decent picture of life without Christ. There's the old thing about the light at the end of the tunnel, being able to see the end because we have something to look forward to, quite literally a light at the end of the tunnel. We have that because of Christ. Christ for us is that light at the end of the tunnel. You think about, I like the example that Paul gave us, Philippians chapter 1 verse 21. He says, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." Paul knew there was a light at the end of the tunnel. He could see that light. He could say, "I have fought the good fight. I have run the race. I have finished my course." 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. That light at the end of the tunnel, as Christians, that's a light that we get to look forward to as well. That's something that we can see as well. There's that appeal. And that's not something that the rest of the world has. We have something to look forward to. We can see the end. And unfortunately, not everyone has that. So that idea of contrast, if you've got light, you've got darkness as well. It's probably not going to be too terribly dark by the time we go out there, or by the time we're done tonight here in just a little while. But that idea of being in the dark, people aren't comfortable driving in the dark. They don't feel safe, they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel perhaps as good as they would like to. And so that idea of having light in our lives is something that's absolutely essential. But one saying that I've always that I've heard and built a sermon around it several years back was, when it's dark, you can see the stars. And so I really think that paints a picture for us. That's really kind of the application that I want to make from this tonight. When it's dark, you can see the stars. Now, we know Jesus is the light of the world. We've already pretty well established that argument, John chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. And as Christians, we are called to reflect that perfect law of liberty, James chapter 1. We're called to let our light so shine before men that they may see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven, Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. But we stand out. That's the idea of light. Light stands out. You ever been up in an airplane at night? It's an incredible view sometimes to fly at night and you can't see anything below you. It's incredible. You can't see the clouds many times, but when you're starting to come down into the city, you can see the lights of the city. You can see them from miles and miles and miles away. Light stands out. That's what we're called to do as Christians. Not physically stand out, spiritually stand out. Let our lights shine. Again, that idea of when it's dark, you can see the stars. The world is compared to darkness. Satan's the prince of the power of the air, the prince of darkness, all of those different things. Has dominion over the world, essentially. For all intents and purposes, much of the world has turned to darkness. But instead of bemoaning the fact that much of the world has turned to darkness, as Christians, we have an opportunity to shine even brighter because of it. The world doesn't have incredibly high standards, but if we go above and beyond, if we're letting our lights shine, if we're not conforming, but we're transformed by the renewing of our minds, as the Hebrew writer would tell us, then that's going to stand out. And that is exactly what we're called to do. One more passage I'd like to look at over here in the Gospels, Mark chapter 15, verse number 33. Mark chapter 15, and this really illustrates the power that darkness can have, but ultimately the power that light can have. Mark chapter 15, verse number 33. Just after Jesus is crucified, it says, "Now when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour." This is the middle of the day. This is 12 o'clock on our calendar. The 6th hour was 12 o'clock based on the Jewish calendar. The middle of the day, and the world goes black. Can you imagine that? There was the solstice a few years back. We were up in Gatlinburg at the time for polishing the pulpit. It was weird to see the world go black like that. That nocturnal animals started coming out into the dark because that's what they were used to. All the animals that were out in the day, they went to bed because it was dark, because everything had changed. It was weird. It was unnatural. It felt like this was 3 hours of darkness on the land. And then Jesus died. And then that's when when Satan thought, "I've won. I've killed the Christ." But then I love to turn over to that story of the resurrection where they see the young man sitting in a long white robe. There's a bright light, all of those different things. It really paints the picture of the contrast that we're looking for. The sin, the darkness of the world contrasted with the beauty and the light of Christ. So while light is indicative of God's nature and of God's power and proof of God's plan, all of those things, there is that contrast. We understand that this is spiritual warfare, is sometimes the illustration we like to use. We want to fight on the side of light, right? And not to use the Star Wars illustration again, but I am, because I'm familiar with Star Wars. Just when it seems like the light can't win, the weight of the darkness of the world is just crushing down on us. The light ultimately did win, right? As Christians, the light will ultimately win. Christ has already defeated death. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 56 through 58. "O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory?" Christ has already overcome death. Christ has already overcome it all. The light has already won. And now it's up to us, Peter tells us in 1 Peter 2, verse 21, to follow in the steps of that example, to let our light shine as well. Now, don't get me wrong, I can't shine as brightly as Jesus Christ, metaphorically speaking. I can't live the life that Christ lived while he was here on this earth. But I'm going to quote a very wise man on this one. I can be the only Bible someone sees in their life. Mr. Mike's been saying that for years and years and years. As long as I can remember, as long as we've been here, that really stands out. I could be the only Bible that someone sees in someone's life. I could be the only light someone sees in their life. Am I shining for Christ? So let's make this practical. That's really where I wanted to take this lesson and the lessons throughout the rest of the week is, sure, we've got some great stories and things like that, but for us as Christians, what does it mean for me? What about us? Turn over, if you would, to Matthew chapter 5, verse number 16. We've already talked about this a little bit. We'll spend the majority of our time here. As we think about this idea of let there be light, back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, where God says, let there be light, that is a command, right? And I'm sure from a young age, just about everyone in here grew up figuring out pretty quickly what a command was, right? You learn, and if you don't, you learn. God says, let there be light. The light came. In much the same way Jesus says in Matthew 5:16, let your light so shine. But I really like the context here. Verse number 14 of Matthew chapter 15. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. So there's those practical two examples. You've got cities that stand out in the dark when they light the lights up. New York City, cities like that. Even Nashville gets really pretty bright at night. We were there last night, and even though it was pitch black and pouring down rain, you could still see some of the lights. It was a mess in Nashville last night, but that's kind of unrelated. But the idea of shining in the darkness. When it's dark, you can see the stars. That's what we're called to do as Christians. We're called to shine. We're called to stand out. We're called to be those stars in the world. Just like that city that's set on a hill, or just like we sang just a little while ago, nobody's going to light a lamp and put it under a basket. You do that when you don't want to be seen. Hide it under a bushel? No, I'm going to let it shine, is the idea that we're given. And it gives light to all who are in the house. We turn that light on, and there are many people that stand to benefit from it. So, and here's something for you to kind of think about. I'm going to give you one, and then I'd like to see what else everyone thinks for the next 10 minutes or so. What are some ways that we can let our light shine for Christ? Make it practical. That's what I want us to be able to take away all week long, is make it practical. I've had some really theoretical Bible classes at school. They've been absolutely phenomenal, dealing with issues that I didn't even know were issues until I started hearing about them and things like that. But I want to make it plain and simple, make it practical for all of us so we can walk away. What are some ways that we can let our light shine before men? First of them, Matthew 5:16, right here, good works. Something as simple as holding the door open for somebody else makes a big difference. I always like to see, usually it's Robert or somebody out there in the front holding the door. You can shake his hand on your way in and things like that. It makes a difference. There's good works. It doesn't have to be anything huge. It doesn't have to be going out and mowing somebody else's lawn. Just looking for opportunities to do good. What else? What are some other ways we can let our light shine? Or what are some practical examples of that? They're just from your experience and things like that.
Not being judgmental.
Not being judgmental. That's a big one. That's one that much of the world has an issue with today. They claim a lot of Christians are just judgmental and in it for themselves. One of the biggest arguments a lot of people have against going to the Lord's church, wherever they may be, being judgmental.
You know, Brad, one of the greatest examples of that in Acts 8, I think.
Which one?
The woman was caught up in adultery,
Mm-hmm.
and she was about to be stoned.
Right.
And the only thing that Christ told her at the end of that story was, go thy way and sin no more.
That's right. John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. Powerful example.
And if there's ever anybody that was able to be so critical about his sin,
Exactly. Exactly. If there was ever someone who could have been judgmental, it was Christ. And yet, Christ said, whoever has no sin, let him cast that first stone. Letting our light shine. It's difficult, but that is one of the biggest practical things that we can do. Is we're not judgmental. Whatever choices someone makes is between them and God. At the end of the day, I'm not going to answer for their choices. They're not going to answer for mine. But if I can show them a better way to live their life, to find salvation, then that is absolutely my duty. Another couple of thoughts here. That idea back in 1 John chapter 1 is walking in the light. Continuing, we have that forgiveness. That's something that we stand to benefit from. And then one of my favorite songs, Send the Light. It's number 572 in the books. There's a call comes ringing over the restless waves. Send the light. It uses the illustration of Paul receiving the Macedonian call. And that's a perfect example. Send the light. The world needs to see that light. We are called to teach. We're called to show that light to others. Matthew chapter 28, verse number 20. And so, as we kind of come to more of the discussion aspect of this, I wanted to get through to make sure we had some time for this with just some stopping points along the way. I want you to stop and think for just a moment. Who are some people in your community, whether it be your congregation? We've got people from several other congregations, where you're from, where you used to live, anything like that. Who are some people? You don't have to mention them by name. Who are some people that you would consider lights in your community? And more importantly, kind of the question we're going to answer is, why would you consider them to be a light for Christ? Yes, sir.
The church elder under whom I served in Illinois when we were up there.
Mm-hmm.
And being in VBS, brethren, catch this, there was a lady of the community that wanted us to come to the local beer joint and pick up her little boy and take him to VBS. And then after VBS, come to the beer joint and drop him off. And of course we refused, and she was so angry, but one of the elders and I went to her house. And boy, she was just rude, crude, and he kept his cool. He stayed calm, he didn't back down, he didn't insult her. He just said, we're not going to do that. That's not the appropriate thing. And I really admired you for that. A lot of us would have lost our cool, especially the way she was talking to us.
That's a difficult one. That's a difficult one. What else?
We all have people in our community that seem like they know when you need help. They don't necessarily call you an ask and just come. And do things for you, get you out.
Right.
Doctors, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
It's not always that person's necessarily a Christian. So I don't know if we would consider that letting them out Christ.
Right.
We could use those kind of people. That's something that we should be more mindful of. Is our neighbors, our friends, whether they be our brothers and sisters in Christ or not. Because, a lot of times when Christ will help people, we do something for them first. That really opens the door.
Right. Right.
If they're hungry, feed them. If they're sick, help them. And then they'll be more receptive to the gospel.
Exactly. Yeah, you basically stole the next point that I really wanted to get into, is that fact that there are many good people on this earth. We work at a pizza shop. And granted, I work in the back, so I don't get to see quite as many of them as some other people do. But there are a lot of good people in this world. Just doing kind things for their neighbor, things like that, helping out, just being good people, letting their light shine. Those are people you want to surround yourself with, right? Those are the people we want to be around. I don't want to be around nasty people that are going to be rude to me or rude to the elders or things like that, and hateful and spitting out all sorts of foul language and things like that. I don't want to be around that. It makes me feel good to be around people who are decent people. And I want to kind of tie that point back in about judgment, that many people don't want to spend time around Christians because they feel like they're judgmental. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I told you wrong. I said Acts 8, that's John.
John chapter 8, yes, sir. Oh, that's all right. But that idea of judgment, people if we're perceived as judgmental, we're not going to get very far. But if we're perceived as good people, if we're doing good deeds and helping out, not seeking any kind of reward for it, we can do something for someone else without having to walk away with a Bible study on our calendar. We can do something good for someone else that could potentially open a door later down the road. But the idea is letting our light shine. We talked about those examples. That's really kind of what I was looking for. Thinking about those traits that people have. Patience is a big one. That's one that I have a whole lot of issues with from time to time. I'm at school, I'm dealing with a whole bunch of immature 18 to 22-year-olds, and I can make fun of them because oftentimes I am one of them. It takes patience to deal with people, but patient people stand out, do they not? You've got people that help out, not necessarily people that you may even know all that well, but people that help out because it's the right thing to do. Those are the people I want to be around. And they're not in it to get paid for it. They're not in it to get recognized for doing what it is that they do. They're in it because it's the right thing to do. And that's really the idea of letting our light shine. Yes, sir?
One thing I got my friends from is friends that have been through the lung transplant. Those are them for strength. Their journey as to how they overcame.
Right. Right.
Those are the people. When I see people in that room, I go in, I have compassion on people that are sick. And that helps me with what I'm going to do.
Right. Exactly. And yeah, you've got a very unique experience with that, but that really does make a difference. To see that there are other people going through the same things that you go through, and oftentimes as Christians we just try and say, well, everything's good, I live for Jesus and all of that. We struggle. We all struggle. We all question our faith from time to time. We all face doubts. We all face temptations. But it's not about putting a mask up and never letting the world see and making the world think that you have to be perfect to come into the church building, to come worship. we're all imperfect, and we're all trying to do our very best to let that light shine.
It's all about souls. We need to recognize that people have souls that are very important, and the first step is inviting them. And I think about, you talk about role models, Miss Alice. How many kids did she bring into church and VBS?
Miss Alice would have had all the pews over here full. My goodness. What a woman. But it's people like that that are willing to go above and beyond, that are willing to let their light shine, which is what we've been thinking about the whole time tonight. So that idea of let there be light, it's important. It attests to God's power. But for us on a personal level, I think it comes back to passages like Matthew 5:16, by doing the best that we can to reach out to the world. By doing good, not expecting anything in return. By doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. So whatever the case may be, we've all got role models that we can look up to. There's always things that we can do to do perhaps a little bit better. But I really like especially thinking about role models, specific people that we can look up to. And I'm sure everyone in here has people like that they're able to look up to, that really epitomize that idea of letting our light shine, by finding people that perhaps have gone through things similar to what you've gone through. Whatever, we've all faced different things in our lives. We'll all continue to face different things throughout our lives. But knowing that we're not alone makes all the difference in the world. Finding people out there that are looking for something. They don't know what it is, but they're looking for something. And being able to give that to them, the greatest gift of all, being able to help someone looking for something. Are there any other thoughts, comments, things like that before we wrap up? All right, well, I appreciate everyone and their input tonight and things like that. That really does make the class go a whole lot better. You don't want to listen to me talk the whole time. I don't want to listen to me talk the whole time. So I appreciate your patience with that. Looking forward to another good lesson coming in tomorrow night. I've got another good teen speaker, at least. I don't know about the adult speaker. He's a piece of work sometimes. But I do appreciate everyone being here tonight. We'll wrap it up here in just a few minutes, and then we'll go downstairs. We'll have snacks and things like that. The kids will be out in just a few minutes. We may get down there early, which means we get to the snacks first. So, the important part.